is now the time to reinstate capital punishment. And for what crimes, I may add as well. I've been asking you this, gbviews at gbnews.uk. We'll go to those shortly. But joining me now to debate this is barrister Chris Daw KC, who's not in favour of reintroducing the death penalty. He's going up against leader of UKIP, Neil Hamilton, who is in favour. Neil, I will start with you. What crimes would you bring the death penalty back for?
Well, we did have the death penalty for murder until I was a boy. I was 18 when capital punishment was abolished, so I remember executions taking place. So certainly murder would be amongst them. It's arguable whether in certain drugs cases with drug dealers and runners and the big boys, it might be a sufficient deterrent to stop the rampant rise in crimes related to drugs. I think this is something which should certainly be considered.
OK, all right, I will throw it your way now. Barrister Chris Daw KC, your views on the death penalty, not at all under any circumstances for any crime, is that right?
No, killing people is wrong. I think most civilised people, and certainly all civilised countries, agree that killing people is wrong. There's no excuse for it. The fact that it's given some sort of air of authenticity by due process of law doesn't make it right. I'm slightly surprised that you've got a crackpot like Neil Hamilton, who used to be my MP, got thrown out for being corrupt. I'm not sure why people like that are even allowed on the air, to be honest with you, anymore. I'm sure you could have got someone who's got a bit more credibility to join this debate.
OK, well, to be honest with you, Chris, I'm going to have to let Neil come back on that.
But my views shouldn't be actually on television. I think that's an interesting comment on my opponent.
OK, all right.
Yeah, I think I'd rather have people who haven't gone through the process of being utterly discredited.
Stop right now, both of you. Stop right now. We are here to talk about the death penalty debate. And frankly, as well, neither of you are going to emerge well out of this if you start lobbing muck at each other. Chris, you are not here to talk about Neil's past politics or anything like that. You're here to give an expert opinion on whether or not we should bring back the death penalty. And I will throw the same thing over to you. Let's just keep it civil, lads, all right? Chris, some people would say...
You've chosen to invite Neil Hamilton on your programme. It's your choice to include him in the debate. So you can hardly be surprised, given his history, when someone's critical of your choice.
Right. So, Chris, there is a political angle to whether or not we should bring back the death penalty, and I'm surprised I have to explain this to you, but Neil obviously is of a particular political view that we should bring back the death penalty, and those are the parameters of this debate. And I'm just going to end this entirely, so you won't even have your views put across, Chris, if you don't stop with all of this stuff. So, Chris, I will go back to you on this now and just ask you, £48,000 a year, roughly, to keep a prisoner alive forever, supposedly. Some people might say it would save us a bit of money if we've got people on a full life tariff. Why is the taxpayer having to pay to keep them in prison when we could just execute them? Your views, Chris.
Well, I'll tell you why, because I'll tell you what the death penalty has a 100% success rate at, and that's killing innocent people. Everywhere there is the death penalty, innocent people are executed. There is no possibility of appeal once you've executed someone. I've been involved in cases myself where innocent people were convicted of murder in this country, served many years in prison, and were eventually released. If Neil had his way, and those who are baying for blood and following this absolute lunatic of a deputy chair of the Conservative Party, who's got no place in a higher level echelons of our government. If people follow that perspective, I'm afraid the end result will be innocent people. They could be you, they could be my children, they could be your husband or wife, they could be anybody, could be accused and convicted of a crime wrongly, as has happened time and time again in this country and others, and innocent people will die. And if I wouldn't want their blood on my hands, and I'm very surprised that Neil Hamilton wants the blood of innocent people on his either.
OK, Neil, I'll throw that back to you. Would you feel as though you had the blood of innocent people on your hands? What about miscarriages of justice, Neil?
Well, obviously miscarriages of justice are possible, but they're far less possible today than they were when capital punishment still survived in this country back in the 1960s. We've got DNA evidence today which wouldn't be available then. And there are cases where there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever about the guilt of the convicted person. Let's take the Yorkshire Ripper, for example, Peter Sutcliffe, or Dr. Shipman, who killed 218 patients. And there are many other egregious cases of that kind. And in Sutcliffe's case, the Yorkshire Ripper, he was in prison at our expense for 40 years. He was imprisoned in 1981 and died only in 2020. And there are plenty of cases like that on the books. So, yes, I suppose it's always possible that there may well be mistakes, but I think in a well system where obviously it would only be in very extreme cases that the death penalty would be imposed. And I think the chances of an error would be quite small. And what about the people who might be deterred from killing innocent people?
Well, that's a big question, Neil. Well, see, that is, you've raised an interesting question there, because, and Chris, I'll throw this back to you, because the figures on whether or not the death penalty is actually a deterrent don't, from America anyway, and this is in relation to gun crimes, etc., to be fair, they don't really appear to indicate that the death penalty is much of a deterrent, do they, Chris?
The evidence is very clear from anywhere that has the death penalty. It's not a deterrent against anything. And I'll tell you why. I've been a criminal defence lawyer for 30 years, and I can tell you one thing. Nobody commits a crime because they think they're going to get caught. People mostly commit murders in the heat of the moment or under the influence of substances or because of a psychiatric illness. Sometimes people plan them in advance, but the one thing that they don't expect to happen to them is to be caught. So the death penalty is no deterrent because people don't think they're ever going to get caught any more than long prison sentences are a deterrent either. People don't think they're going to get caught, and that's why they commit crimes.
Neil, if I look at the stats on this,
that seems to be an argument against any form of punishment. Then, if you think,
well, okay, all right, Neil. Let me just ask you this, Neil. Let me ask you this now. If I just look at the latest stats from YouGov, right, it says that apparently 54% of the people they surveyed would support the death penalty for terror offences, so terrorists, who were going to go on to kill. So not your terrorist who looked at something fruity online, someone who was planning a late-stage terror attack. Also, 40% of Brits support the death penalty, supposedly. 10% of people are unsure. Neil, do you think this is the kind of thing that should go to a public vote?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I'm in favour of referenda. I think because the political classes generally are so out of kilter with the views of ordinary people on so many issues that referenda are the only ways in which we can express our views effectively.
OK, and you would be happy to call for one, would you? What about people, they say, for example, who would be like a battered wife and she snaps one day? Technically, she's guilty of murder. We couldn't have a blanket death penalty for murderers in that case, surely, Neil. Would you be saying that this is a case-by-case basis, Neil, for you?
Yeah, certainly. Obviously, in the case that you pose, there would be diminished responsibility of some kind. And even under the old law, I don't think he would be likely, on a conviction, there to merit the capital sentence.
OK, and Chris, I'll throw it your way. What if the family could say, well, look, this is the only way that we think justice can be served. This guy, absolutely 100%. I'm going to wheel this out. I think it's the classic case that gets wheeled out in situations like this. It's the Wayne Couzens, Sarah Everard thing. This guy, bang to rights, full life tariff, clearly can never walk the streets again. And hypothetically, if their family said, we want this guy executed, what would you say to them?
I would say to them, I'm sorry, but we have a system of criminal justice which is public justice, not private justice. It's not about individuals choosing the punishment for an offender. That went out, I think, roughly about 2,000 years ago in Roman times, the idea of sort of blood money and families of being able to choose the punishment of people who'd wronged them. These are ancient, sort of almost Old Testament ideas about justice. Justice is supposed to serve the public interest, not the private interests of victims or their families. They are not going to, I'm afraid, ever get their loved one back by the death penalty being imposed. And my experience of the evidence is that where the death penalty is imposed, the families of those who have been killed, they don't really get any form of closure or satisfaction from that. And overall, it makes society a nastier and more unpleasant place. And we need to look at ways to actually reduce crime rather than sort of banging the drum for old-fashioned sentences that went out with the Ark.
All right, both of you, thank you very much. We got there in the end, chaps. So something that I thought was going to have to knock on the head very early on. So thank you very much. That is Barrister Chris Daw KC, who's not in favour of introducing the death penalty, or Neil Hamilton, for that matter. And he was up against the leader of UKIP, Neil Hamilton. So we go.